Chapter 15, Biodiversity and Conservation. This chapter starts out talking about just one of the many issues worldwide that we face and that we've been facing for a long time now. Frogs, for example, are what are called bellwether species, meaning that if something is affecting them, if their populations are declining, then it means something is really going wrong with the environment they live in. Frogs live in the water, so anything that gets in the environment ultimately ends up in the water, right? We've already talked about that. So if the frogs start feeling the negative side effects of something, then we need to start trying to find what that problem is, because if the frogs start having a problem and disappearing, declining, then that means there probably are a lot of other things that are either already affected or are going to be affected in the near future. It's estimated at least 42% of the 6,000 plus known amphibian species are declining. So frogs, newts, all kinds of amphibians declining worldwide. About a third of all species are threatened. About 165 have already become extinct just in the last 45 years or so worldwide. And there probably are more than that. These are the ones that are thought to have become extinct. But again, there could be even more than that in places where we just don't pay attention. The Amazon rainforests and other parts of the world where not a lot of humans live, or areas where we're not really studying what's going on. So far, there really isn't just one specific cause that's resulting in these die-offs. It is a combination of many of the things that we've already talked about. This is kind of one of those chapters where a lot of, well, pretty much everything that we've spoken about in all the previous chapters now kind of comes together. The things that we do to the environment that simplify it or that create a loss of biodiversity potentially can have a catastrophic effect on the rest of the things in that environment. So we know that the frogs are being threatened by habitat loss. If their habitat is converted to something else, then clearly that's a problem. Lots and lots of chemicals that get into the environment, that's another partial reason. Diseases that are either spreading or becoming more problematic because of things we've done to the environment. Climate change, the effects of UV radiation because of changes in the ozone layer. A fungal disease has been found in 43 countries and 36 states in the U.S. that can actually exacerbate other problems that the frogs are already facing. So it may not kill them outright, but it can create additional problems. So the image on the lower right of the slide summarizes the threats to global amphibian species. Not only habitat loss, invasive species, other animals that have kind of taken over areas. Bullfrogs, for example, they are native to the U.S., but they've spread all the way out to California now and can create huge problems. So again, just lots and lots of problems that all add up to threatening our frog populations. So a couple definitions in this realm. A species is a group of distinct living things that are capable of breeding with one another in the wild, but they don't interbreed with other living things that are outside of their closely related group. It's estimated, and again, it's a best estimate based on science, that there are somewhere between 5 and 100 million species worldwide. we know that we're finding about 10,000 new species every year. A lot of those are insects and different small organisms. But again, the question that kind of pops up is, why haven't we been able to do a better job of narrowing that number down? Somewhere between 5 and 100 million seems like a huge range of numbers. But again, it goes back to the previous statement on the other slide. There are so many areas in the world where there just aren't many humans, and there aren't many humans studying the environment. So there could be hundreds, thousands, millions of species living in remote places in tropical jungles around the world that we just haven't found yet, we just haven't identified yet. So that kind of, again, creates a wide range of possibilities. Species richness is an important concept to understand if we're going to understand the concept of biologic diversity. Richness refers to the number of different species in a community, and certainly it varies from community to community. Go back to the chapter on biomes. If the biome has a lot of plant diversity, it can have a lot of animal diversity, and that's all dictated by the temperature and precipitation as the two typical measures. Richness relates to the abundance of potential niches. So again, if we have a greater diversity of plants because we have a climate that's suitable to allow for a great abundance, then we can have a lot more diversity of all the animals because there are more niches that are available in a diverse community. Species richness also is inversely related to how isolated a community is. So for example, if you think about an island, one small island that's out in the middle of the ocean is going to be pretty hard for living things to find. By accident, a bird that's flying out over the ocean might get blown off course and might land on the island sheerly by accident. But it's pretty hard to find a remote, single, isolated island. And so it's hard to colonize an area like that, meaning you're not going to have a lot of diversity on a very remote island. But if you have a bunch of islands that are pretty close to the coast of a country, it's not that hard for certain animals, like birds initially, to find those islands and colonize them. And once they start colonizing them, it might not be that hard for other species to find that island. Or the birds might eat plants on the mainland. And then if they poo the seeds out on the island they're now living on, those plants can become established. So that's what I mean by inversely related to isolation. The more isolated a community is, the more likely that it's going to have a low richness, whereas if it's close to other places, it's likely to have a much higher species richness. And so in these remote areas, if something goes extinct, it's not likely going to be replaced very quickly, again, because it's hard to colonize remote areas. And this also means that richness is inversely related to environmental stress. The more an environment is changed or affected or stressed, whether it's by humans doing something to the environment to change it, or whether the environment is, say, near a really active volcano, a more stressed environment is going to have a much lower species richness as well. If an environment isn't stable, it's hard for things to colonize and to sustain themselves on an area that's constantly being affected or stressed. Again, whether it's by humans or by natural events. Richness is also usually greater in areas that we call ecotones. An ecotone is a transition zone where two or more communities come together. Obvious example would be a forest, and then a forest being next to an open meadow. where the meadow and the forest come together in that transition zone, we call that an ecotone. And at those transition zones between two or more communities, you tend to have a greater diversity or species richness, plants and animals. And so then this creates what's called an edge effect. Because you have a greater diversity of plants and animals in these ecotones, you have a greater change in species composition. So you might have a certain level of diversity in the forest, you might have a different type of diversity in the meadow, but in that ecotone you tend to have a greater species richness. Also, the geologic history of an area affects species richness. So some areas where climates have been stable for a long time, there's a greater potential to have a greater species richness because they've just literally had more time to evolve without the environment being dramatically affected. Whereas in areas that have been repeatedly affected or the climate has been disrupted, you tend to have a lower species richness. So you may have heard of examples in areas where now you have a very cold kind of climate, but in the past it might have been more like a warm, swampy environment. As the climate in that area changed, it upset the environment to the point where the species of plants and animals living there were affected. So in very stable climates, typically like we've had near the equator, those climates have been like that for a very long time. And because they've been stable for a very long time, they've been able to evolve the great amount of species richness that we associate with tropical zones. So biodiversity then is basically a concept of how many different varieties of living things do we have on the planet. But there's also kind of three levels to biodiversity. We can look at the genetic level of biodiversity. We can look at species richness, which we've been talking about on the previous slides. How many different species there are on the planet. And then we can also look at a third level, which is ecosystem diversity. How many different ecosystems. So again, we're basically going from the genetic level to the individual living thing to the ecosystem diversity around the planet. So we've talked about all of the things that we've done on this planet as humans that could impact the diversity of living things on the planet. Humans depend on basically the living things on this planet for our survival. Going way back in time, when we had to hunt if we wanted to eat meat, we had to gather plants for the fruit or as vegetables or as leaves, roots, whatever. So we intimately were dependent on the living things on this planet for our survival. Even today, even though we cultivate our plants primarily, we raise our meat for domesticated animals for our meat, we still very much depend on all of the living things on this planet for our survival. People probably have forgotten things like just how important insects are. We typically think of a bug when it's bothering us, when it's a mosquito that's biting us or a bug that's eating our garden plants. But you notice around the area, especially around this time of the year, all the beehives, all the apiaries, driving past a fruit orchard and noticing all the beehives that are set up early in the spring in order to pollinate the flowers so that those trees actually produce fruit. Even if we don't, move bees to an orchard to pollinate our fruit trees, insects are still responsible for every single fruit or vegetable that we eat. We still depend on them to pollinate our fruits and vegetables. We depend on species to help us control weeds naturally, pest control, bacteria and fungi that we depend on for food, to provide antibiotics that can help keep us healthy. Worldwide, at least 250,000 out of about 310,000 plant species haven't been assessed yet for any medicinal, agricultural, or industrial value. Yet again, we know that past and future cures for diseases will come through medical advances based on some compound that we find in a plant. The Pacific yew has a compound called Taxol that we discovered quite a while ago that is very effective at treating some forms of cancer. So we kind of associate the chemicals and medicines and those things as coming out of a laboratory somewhere that a scientist created, from a bunch of chemicals in a laboratory. Yet the vast majority of these things come from some plant or animal or some other living thing out living in the environment somewhere. And again, when you look at all the diversity in the rainforests in areas that are not really accessible, there could be thousands and thousands of plants out there that might contain that one chemical that cures a disease that we don't have a cure for yet. So the big challenge, or the big problem is then, if we let that plant go extinct before we find the chemical that could treat a disease, we've just maybe lost out on that. So even if there are no other reasons for maintaining all of the diversity in the world, it could be that. It could be that one plant that provides a chemical that cures a disease. It could be that one plant that we can, grow and modify in a way that provides some food that has some incredible nutritional value that can help address world hunger. But again, if we let these things disappear before we identify them, we may never know or have the ability then to deal with that problem. Ecosystem services that are provided by the environment, that we've already talked a lot about those. Just the ability of the environment to provide us with clean water and clean air. All of those things are available because of diversity, because we have richness of species in the environment. The activities of all organisms in an ecosystem are interrelated, and it's all of these interrelationships that provide for the stability and health of the environment, which again then ultimately provides us with all of the things that we have depended on. When one species declines, if you have a diverse environment, another species that is related to that may decline, or it might even increase in number if it doesn't have competition anymore. Increased species richness, in other words, having the normal amount of diversity in an environment, ultimately improves the ability of a given community to withstand disturbances to the environment. Again, whether those disturbances are natural or whether they are created by humans. If a community is diverse and stable, it can provide us with the ecosystem services, and if something does affect it, whether it's human or natural, a diverse community, a stable community, can resist that and bounce back if something happens to it. So table 15.1 just kind of reiterates some of the ecosystem services that are provided by ecosystem. Forests, healthy forests being able to clean our air and water, maintain soil, store carbon dioxide, provide wildlife habitat, provide us with a place to go enjoy, and products like wood. All of the freshwater ecosystems, all the values they provide, grasslands, our coastal areas. Again, we've talked about most of these before in the other chapters. But again, it's not possible to maintain these ecosystem services unless we can maintain the diversity and the richness of these ecosystems. When we oversimplify our forests, we affect the ability of those forests to do these things. When we pollute our freshwater systems, we affect their ability to do the ecosystem services. When we eliminate our grasslands and convert them to agriculture, we affect their ability to do those services. When we develop our coastlands and get rid of the natural habitat, we affect those areas with respect to the ecosystem services they provide. So again, that's why I say that this chapter ties back into everything else we've been talking about. If we don't maintain diversity, we can't maintain the health of our environment, and therefore it's going to be more susceptible to the things that we do to it in a negative way. We've already talked about this in a previous chapter, so I'm not going to spend any more time kind of talking about the importance of genetic diversity. Again, that's one of the levels of diversity that we have to be aware of, and we already talked about this in the previous chapter. I guess the one thing I'll add to this slide that we didn't touch on is the diversity that we have today didn't happen overnight. It took hundreds of millions of years to create the genetic diversity that we have today. And so in order to, maintain our diversity, once we lose genetic diversity, it's not coming back, in other words. I guess that's the take-home message. Because it's taken so long to get the diversity we have, if we do something that changes that diversity, that decreases it, it's not something we can just fix. It's not something that maybe ever will come back to what it was. So it's again that diversity that may hold the solution to a problem, and it may even be able to solve problems that we haven't even imagined yet. But if we lose that diversity, then the potential solution is gone, and we may never even know that the solution was out there. Just with the pharmaceutical industry alone, medications like the AZT for treating AIDS is a compound that was extracted from sponges in the ocean. The 20 best-selling prescription drugs, in other words, the most prescribed prescription drugs, are all natural compounds that may have been modified, or once we identified the chemical nature of that natural compound, we might have been able to create synthetic versions of it. But those, again, were from naturally occurring plants or animals. The agriculture importance is obvious. Again, we need to eat to survive. All of the agricultural crops we grow today, we didn't just create them from nowhere. Those plants originated from some natural plant that maybe we ate and decided that we could create a more productive version of that plant. And then we domesticated it, and now we depend on it. But those plants, again, they didn't come from nowhere. They came from a real natural plant somewhere in the world. Our industrial technology, oils, lubricants, perfumes, fragrances, dyes, again, paper and lumber products, waxes, latex, all are derived from naturally occurring chemicals that, again, maybe we've made synthetic versions of them now, but we were only able to do that because we found a naturally occurring product that we were able to then break down chemically and recreate it in a lab. other aesthetic, cultural, spiritual values of organisms. The book states our world is a thing of beauty largely because of the diversity. How boring would the world be if you looked out your door and there was one kind of tree that you could see for miles and miles, or just one bird species? It would be pretty boring. So again, there are values that are beyond just the value of money. Deriving pharmaceuticals from plants provides those companies with lots and lots of money, but it also provides the bigger picture of jobs for people that can then contribute to the economy. And those chemicals, those prescription drugs, also help people lead healthier lives, keep them alive when in the past they might have died from a condition that now is treatable. So certainly there are economic values for maintaining diversity, but there's also those non-economic values for maintaining the biologic diversity on this planet. A couple more terms. Extinction is basically the elimination of a species from the earth. And keep in mind that extinction, things do die, species I should say, go extinct naturally. That's normal. That's called background extinction. That's the continuous level of things going extinct on the planet just because it's the end of their time. So this would be not with humans affecting the environment in a negative way that causes something to go extinct. All living things on this planet have come into existence, evolved over time, and then eventually they go extinct just because of changes, natural changes to the environment. And we've also had what are referred to as mass extinction events, where something like a large meteor hits the planet and changes the climate, resulting in the extinction of a large number of species in a relatively short amount of time. And again, although these are natural processes, extinction, mass extinction, the impact that we have, or potentially can have on the planet, can greatly accelerate the extinction rate. We have, since we've become more numerous on this planet, have definitely had greater ability to disrupt habitats, creating the extinction of species. We've hunted species to extinction. We've changed habitat to the point where certain species would no longer be able to exist. Today, we know that biodiversity has declined at a rate that's much, much higher than anything we've been able to look at in the past, looking at fossil records. Anywhere from 100 to 1,000 times greater than just the natural rate of extinction. So again, it's clear that we have had a bigger impact on biodiversity because of the things we do to the planet. This image is just a handful of certain species that have become endangered or extinct around the planet. It's estimated probably 20,000 plants and animal species are threatened with extinction if we don't preserve their habitat or change whatever it is that is driving their endangerment or extinction. Species worldwide that exist in areas, again, where there aren't many people might be affected by us to the point where they might go extinct, and we might never even know that they existed. We may never have even identified them, and yet something we're doing nearby could drive their extinction. So again, it's things that we see in our backyards that we can keep from going extinct. That's one challenge. But it's all those other places in the world, those other developing countries where things are being threatened as well, that may not even have the ability to be identified before they're driven to extinction. So to address this concern, the Endangered Species Act was created back in the 70s that legally defined, first of all, what an endangered species or a threatened species is. If you want to stop something from going extinct, clearly you have to start by identifying those things. So an endangered species is defined as a species, and again, this is any living thing that is in imminent danger of extinction in all or part of its range. And that's the most critical designation that we can give something, because it's going to go extinct if we don't fix the problem right away. A threatened species is a species whose population has declined, and it's getting to that point where it may become an endangered species. Maybe not yet, but it could in the future if we don't, again, identify what the problem is and try to resolve it. So not only are we losing species, but we're losing their genetic variability. And when a species decreases in number, for example, the California condor was down to something like 12, 14, 16 individuals that were left, period, and we captured them and bred them in captivity. But even now, if we look at the population, which is, I've forgotten the number, it's maybe up to 2,000 individuals now in the wild and in captivity. We've gone from, let's say, a dozen to 2,000. The genetic diversity of those 2,000 is still very, very small compared to the diversity that would have occurred in the wild before they dropped to near extinction. So again, think about the genetic diversity of humans in the world. We've got all of the different cultures around the world, the Caucasian groups, the individuals of Hispanic descent, Black descent, Asian. We've got all of that diversity worldwide. If everybody on the planet was killed except for people living in the town of Reading, gotta save my own town, of course, how much of the worldwide human genetic diversity would be eliminated if now there were only 90,000 people left on the planet and they only came from one population? Now again, there are people in Reading of Asian descent and Black descent and a lot of other ethnic groups. But certainly there would be a lot of ethnic groups worldwide that wouldn't be represented anymore. So it represents the same sort of problem, but even a bigger problem in wild animals, that if we lose that genetic diversity, even if we save the species and we breed it in captivity, it's never going to be as diverse as it was prior to its endangerment. So certainly this is a concern throughout the United States, particularly in places like Hawaii, because again, we're talking about remote islands that now are heavily populated by humans. About 63% of the species on the Hawaiian Islands are at risk. At least two-thirds of the native forests are gone. They've been removed for human habitation, agriculture, those kinds of things. The islands have been affected in the past by non-native species. Rats got on the islands on grain ships. Eventually, we as humans decided we got to get rid of the rats. So we introduced snakes, brown tree snakes, to eat the rats. They did a good job, and once the rats were pretty much gone, then what happens? Well, snakes start eating all the native birds and the eggs. Oh, got to get rid of the snakes. Let's introduce the mongoose. Mongoose do a great job of getting rid of the snakes, but when the snakes are gone, what do they start doing? Eating the native animals. Now pretty much, I guess, we were there a couple years ago. I was talking to some people about this. Pretty much those other things are not a problem. The mongoose kind of were controlled for the most part. But now it's things like feral cats that are eating the native species and creating a problem. So again, when you have a remote island, you can have a much greater impact on diversity, humans anyway. California, just because of our population and the fact that we are actually a biodiversity hotspot, about a third of our species are at risk because of things that primarily we are doing to the environment and because we're the most populous state. But it's also a very serious concern in the rest of the world, particularly those high biodiversity areas like our rainforests. They're being destroyed for human settlements, to grow bananas and coffee beans to sell to the rest of the world. Oil and mineral extraction, trying to diversify their economic base so they can go through industrialization. Again, all of these alternative uses of the environment means habitat's going away, and if habitat's going away, species are disappearing. Many species are endemic to these areas, meaning this may be the only place in the world they're found. California has a lot of endemic species that are only found here. And if they're wiped out from the only place in the world they're found, they're gone, obviously, forever. So all of the things we've talked about that affect the environment, conversion to agriculture, conversion to human habitation, deforestation, all of those things affect the natural evolution of species. And again, that's a negative thing that affects the ability of those environments to provide us with the ecosystem services. There's an Enviro discovery that specifically talks about is your coffee bird friendly? Again, much of the world demands coffee, and because of the climate, much of the rainforest areas are suitable climates to grow coffee beans. And so in the past, it was pretty much you cut down a bunch of rainforest and you plant coffee plants. So our habits, the amount of coffee that we in America alone drink, has probably created the deforestation of who knows how many acres of tropical rainforest. Another one of those things that people don't think about. You know, they don't want a tree cut down in California, so they protest that. And then that tree comes from somewhere else in the world, so they can still live in a wooden home. They may continue drinking coffee and not ever realize just how much of an impact that can have on the rainforest in another country. How many species might go extinct or already have gone extinct because of our coffee habit. The challenge has typically been, again, that coffee plantations are created by clear-cutting rainforests because coffee plants need full sunlight. And so what's happened is basically creating varieties that can be grown under the shade of the rainforest. So we don't have to cut the rainforest down. Most of the plants are still going to be intact to provide habitat for birds, for example. And so basically we're creating a more organically grown coffee bean in these countries. We don't need as much chemical and pesticide, fertilizers, etc. And basically preserving habitat, but yet still being able to grow a product that provides that country with money and provides the rest of us with the product that we demand. So I mentioned the term hotspot. These are areas that may be relatively small, but they contain a large number of endemic species. And potentially, if these small areas coincide with an area that we want to use, we can eliminate a lot of plants or animals by just eliminating a relatively small amount of space. And so that's why these are really of concern. Because again, we can do a lot of damage by eliminating a little bit of habitat. There are 25 hotspots worldwide that contain about a third of the world's endemic species. Up to half of the endemic amphibian species live in these 25 hotspots. 20% of the world's human population lives within these hotspots. 15 of them are in tropical areas, but 9 of them are on islands, either exclusively or mostly on islands. So again, the challenge here is these areas contain a lot of diversity in a small amount of area, and about a fifth of the world's population live within these hotspots. So it's hard to balance us living in an area where these hotspots occur, because again, it doesn't take much damage to really change or eliminate a lot of species. So this map shows in the red areas where these hotspots are. You can see the California floristic province that pretty much spans most of the coast of western United States. And then also Mesoamerica, big chunks of area in South America, island areas like Madagascar, South Central China, and most of the South Pacific. So again, lots of areas around the world where there are ever-growing human populations. So it's going to be a huge challenge for us to continue human population growth on these areas without totally destroying the biodiversity. So typically, there's more than one thing that happens to create extinction or endangerment. Losing or destroying habitat tends to be one of the biggest causes for species extinction. And that can be because of pollution that we create, invasive species that we've put there or that we've allowed to occur, over-exploiting our resource, overutilizing timber, overutilizing the habitat for something that we depend on. But ultimately, all of these things are caused by human populations. And whether it's our demand for, extracting things that create economic value, whether it's, utilizing things for technology, social, political, cultural factors, but ultimately habitat loss that we cause for all these values that we have for the environment is the greatest contributor, the single greatest contributor to species endangerment or extinction. And the circular image on the side there kind of shows how all of these things are related ultimately to declining biologic diversity. And the more of us there are on the planet, the greater the impact of these things are going to have on habitat loss. Habitat loss in general is a problem, and fragmentation is a component of that. Before we were as numerous, the habitat was the way it was: no fences, no roads. We didn't get rid of some forests to grow crops. We didn't get rid of some grassland, for human habitation. So because of us being on this planet and how abundant we are, we have broken the habitat up into pieces that we've changed from how they were naturally. So fragmentation is the breakup of large areas of habitat into small isolated patches. And we really think of these as being islands. If you look at these patches of woodlands surrounded by agriculture, it's really exactly like islands out in the ocean. Some islands are close together like these patches of woodlands are, and some islands are farther apart, just like on land. So basically conflicts, land use conflicts, that are created between humans and then the naturally occurring species. Generally, those naturally occurring species lose out, and fragmentation can dramatically negatively impact wild species to the point of their going extinct. So there was a group of people that maybe back around the 90s started looking at images like this and thought to themselves, to study and understand fragmentation, it really is just like islands. We talked about how islands, remote islands, tend to have a greater, I should say a lesser amount of biodiversity. So remote fragments of land, like remote fragments of woodlands, if they're separated by a lot of other land, they're going to have lower diversity than fragments that are closer together. So we started relating the concept of islands to land islands, fragments of habitat. So although habitat change is the biggest factor, certainly pollution is another human-caused factor that affects endangerment and extinction. And these are all things we've already talked about, including climate change, the introduction of exotic or invasive species of plants or animals, things that have gotten into an area that they never were before, have worldwide had huge impacts on the native species. And a lot of them really thrive in this habitat that we've created, this fragmented habitat, or the areas that are being disturbed constantly by human activities. A lot of times these invasive species thrive in those kinds of habitats, whereas the native species haven't evolved with that, and so they don't do as well. Let's focus on invasive species for a minute. We're basically, again, looking at non-native species that get into an ecosystem where they didn't evolve. And so they have a huge potential to upset the balance of the living things within that environment, because again, the living things didn't evolve with those non-native species. And so the non-native species can really interfere with how that whole ecosystem works. There are a few different ways that invasive species can come to be. Sometimes they just find their way into an environment naturally. But in most cases, it's because of humans. Either we intentionally put something in an environment. Going back to the example of Hawaii that I gave, we intentionally put snakes there to get rid of the rats, and then we intentionally put the mongoose there to get rid of the snakes, and we intentionally brought cats and let them get wild or feral. But there also are certainly non-intentional introductions of species into an environment. The zebra mussel was able to get into the ballast tanks of ships, and when those ships then get into areas, the zebra mussel or their eggs, spores, get out and then can reproduce. And that alone, the zebra mussel alone, has caused an estimated $5 billion a year in the cost to control them and clean up the after effects of them. In Lake Michigan, so zebra mussels have gotten into all kinds of places, including the Great Lakes, as ships come in from the ocean. My sister and brother-in-law live back in Wisconsin, and they were visiting some friends for a party, and their house is on Lake Michigan. And while they were there, they noticed there were bulldozers on the beaches pushing what they found out were zebra mussels into piles, heaping piles that were being scooped into dump trucks and being hauled away from the beach. they were reproducing and becoming so abundant that when they would die off at the end of their life cycle, they'd wash up on the beach in millions and millions and millions. So again, somebody is paying for that cleanup, and again, it's not cheap. So not only the obvious stuff, but if there are that many zebra mussels in an area, they are likely replacing a lot of other native species that would have had a similar niche. And so then what's the long-term impact of the loss of biodiversity? That may be impossible to predict. Sometimes another reason species have become endangered or have gone extinct is because we've overused them. We've driven things to extinction because we've used them as food sources. Imagine back when we were exploring the world, ships would set off with water and food, but along the way, oftentimes they had to find new sources of food and new sources of fresh water to restock their supplies. If they found an island, and on that island they found an animal that was easy to catch, tortoises, birds that were flightless birds like relatives to penguins that couldn't fly, or other slow-moving animals, they were easy to totally wipe them out as a source of food. And so certainly lots of examples of overhunting things to extinction. But other examples of taking animals out of the wild for other things, like these birds being trapped out of the wild to be sold around the world to pet stores. So lots of birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish. I remember even growing up when there were monkeys in pet stores before those kinds of things were eliminated. So worldwide, just the removing things from the wild to be able to sell them as pets. If you have pets other than, dogs and cats, if you have more exotic pets like birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, it really does make sense to find out where they come from. A lot of these things are now being bred in captivity, but there are species that just don't breed in captivity, and they may be taken directly from the wild to be used in aquariums. Now, in this country, there is regulations on that, but not so much in South America. So if there's a demand somewhere in the world for these types of parrots, they will continue trapping them out of the wild. And on top of just that factor, the sad thing is that so many of these animals die before they ever get to where they're headed, because they're not treated very well, they're not necessarily fed very well, or kept in optimal conditions. And so a huge percentage of these things die before they ever make it to a pet store somewhere in the world. So again, one of those things that we can do as consumers is ask that pet store, where these animals came from. And if they're, taken directly out of the wild, then don't choose to take those individuals. Tell the pet store you want more captively bred species to have as pets. So conservation biology is a relatively new science. It probably initiated somewhere back in the 1990s. And prior to this time, we often looked at things from the standpoint of let's manage this, or let's get the habitat back to how it was before humans got here. Let's make it pristine. Let's manage it so that, again, it's like it was before there were humans here. Well, folks, we're here to stay. We're not going anywhere. And as we've already talked about, there are going to be more of us on this planet tomorrow than there are today. So there were some folks that, again, back in the 90s decided we need to really look more at studying how humans affect organisms and basically take the approach that humans are always going to be part of the environment, and there's no way we're going to be able to manage the world as if we weren't here, because we are here, and there are an awful lot of us. So conservation biology looks at how we affect things, how we can develop ways to maintain biodiversity in situ by establishing parks and reserves where that's possible to maintain biodiversity, or where we need to ex situ, which involves maintaining diversity in zoos or botanical gardens, or collecting seeds and preserving them for the future. So again, basically taking humans into account, because we're here and we're not going anywhere. That may seem obvious now, again, but prior to that, we always kind of had this notion that we wanted to manage the world as if we weren't here. And we realized that wasn't possible. So, if habitat destruction is the primary reason for species extinction and endangerment, then obviously protecting habitats has to be pretty high on our priority list. So protecting habitats involves conserving them, managing ecosystems as a whole, and that's really the best way to preserve biodiversity. We know that our activities adversely affect sustainability. We just talked about how important it is to try and manage our world more sustainably. And to do that, active management is going to be necessary for that to be. Actively managing the environment in such a way that we can use it for the things that we depend on. But again, if it's done sustainably, that means that the environment also is still going to be able to remain healthy and maintain biodiversity. There are 100,000 national parks, preserves, sanctuaries, refuges that exist worldwide. That whole concept started here in the United States and now has spread worldwide. But even with that, and even as big as some of them are, look at a place like Yellowstone that is several million acres in size. It is still, as big as it is, not a full functional ecosystem. It still is a fragment of a much bigger ecosystem that existed before we came along. And that's certainly a problem worldwide. There are so many of these areas that are just too small to fully preserve biodiversity. They may be too isolated from each other. Again, whether they're islands in the ocean that are far apart or pieces of land that are far apart, if they're isolated, they just may not be able to maintain the diversity that was once there. And although in the United States we tend to put a priority on these things, and we have the expertise and maybe not enough money, but at least we have money dedicated to managing and preserving these areas, worldwide that isn't the case. Worldwide, these areas may not fully have the support of the governments, just because, do I spend money on, developing a technology that'll keep the country self-sufficient, or do I spend money preserving habitat that nobody can use? Economics is going to win out in countries where they don't have enough food to feed their people. Because we started preserving these areas many times after we already lost some of the biodiversity, they just don't have the full biodiversity they did before, and again, they may never be able to reach that level again. And in areas that are really, really in need of setting these lands aside, areas like rainforests, tropical grasslands, river basins in much of the world, these, again, areas occur in countries that just haven't or can't economically make this a priority. because they need those rainforests to be able to cut down trees to sell, to make money, or to clear cut to farm, or develop for tourism. So, protecting habitats needs to be the #1 priority, but worldwide, it's still a challenge to tell somebody to save a habitat when they still need it for their survival. So this image kind of summarizes those challenges. We still, as much as we think we know, we still don't know that much about ecosystems. So we've got to continue doing research. We've got to continue doing effective conservation management and adapting to the knowledge that we get. Integrating the fact that humans are part of the environment, and we have to consider that when we're making environmental decisions. Finding ways to protect areas, but because of the fragmentation, try and find ways to rebuild natural populations as much as possible. Connect them. That's a big challenge, and it may never happen in some areas. But that's what we need to strive for. And again, just so many problems worldwide that we have to continue addressing. If we're the problem, if we've caused the problem, then we have to be the solution. In the United States, we have a national wildlife refuge system that was started by President Theodore Roosevelt back in the early 1900s. He was a hunter, and at least partially because of that, decided that it would be important not only to have areas that we could continue to utilize, but also areas that we should probably set aside for wildlife, so they would have habitat to continue to exist on this planet. It's the most extensive network of land and water that's committed to preserving wildlife in the entire world. Again, we're the first country to have a park system, a national park system, where land is set aside completely to preserve it. We're also the most extensive land network that's set aside to maintain wildlife. Now, again, the national refuges aren't purely for wildlife preservation, because wildlife refuges do allow hunting. So probably more appropriately, the book should have said wildlife conservation. Some areas in refuges are set aside to give a safe place for animals to breed and do their thing. But again, some areas are open to the public for hunting or fishing or even just wildlife observation. The U.S. has over 500 refuges, at least one in every state, that account for over 90 million acres of land. And ultimately, these areas were chosen for the idea of preserving all of the major ecosystems in the United States. So these areas represent native grasslands, native wetlands, again, all the different types of aquatic ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems. So they weren't necessarily set aside to save or preserve a specific type of animal or plant, but rather the entire ecosystem, which again is important to distinguish. Because again, if we're preserving or conserving an ecosystem, then by definition we're providing habitat for all of the plants and animals that use that ecosystem, and by definition we are then allowing for those ecosystem services to be provided to us. So restoration ecology then is a study of the historical condition of ecosystems that were affected or damaged by humans, with the goal being to restore it as closely as possible to the way it used to be. And so again, this is a newer aspect of conservation biology, looking at reclaiming disturbed lands converting them back to areas that have higher ecological diversity, more like they were before we got here and messed with them, and still basing the restoration on understanding the ecological principles that drive these ecosystems, so that ultimately they become functional, healthy ecosystems that are self-sustaining, so that these habitats are now available for the wildlife that use them. The soil can be sustainable. But again, it doesn't come cheap. It takes time, it takes money, it takes expertise, it takes the people to know what they're doing to get the environment back to the way it was. And yet this is, again, a very important part of the in situ conservation that is necessary within conservation biology. Getting the environment itself healthy and functional so it can support the diversity of plants and animals that depend on it for their survival, which ultimately means our survival. Conservation organizations worldwide are an essential part of the effort to maintain biodiversity. These groups help educate the people that make the policies and laws so they know what their decisions will mean in the future, how their decisions will impact the environment. These conservation organizations help kind of pull together public support when there are environmental issues that we need to address. And they are also a way to gather financial support for projects by people donating their money and their time. Oftentimes these groups work with zoos and aquaria, botanical gardens, as a way to pull together resources to be able to allow these projects to go forward, so they can provide the ultimate benefit to biodiversity. But again, it takes financial support for these kinds of projects to occur. And very importantly, in my mind, it also takes that ecological knowledge, people that are trained, who know what they're doing to the environment to make it healthy again. Let me go back for just 1 second. There are so many conservation organizations out there that you probably see on TV. You probably get things from them in the mail asking you to join or give a little bit of money. And again, a lot of them do really good things. But just like I talked about with organic food, if you choose to donate some of your money to these groups, please check the group's website, read what it is that they do, what is their value statement, and very importantly, where does the money go? For every dollar you donate, how much of that money goes to actually doing environmental work, as opposed to money that goes for supporting, the administration. And also, some of these groups are run by good business people, but not necessarily biologists. There are, unfortunately, groups out there that don't know what they're talking about. I guess that's the only way I can put it. There are groups out there that have all these great ideas, and they get money, and they fight or support different projects. But how many of those people are biologists that know why or know the details about things that happen? So again, make sure if you're going to give money, and you should consider it, not only give money by first, again, making sure you agree with that organization, but also make sure you agree with what they're doing and why they're doing it. And then even maybe as important as volunteering your money is volunteering your time for these organizations that you really want to support. And I would even say look locally rather than nationally at first. There are so many good local organizations that deal with trying to help preserve our local environment. And so look into those first and consider your money and your time going to the local groups, watershed groups, conservation districts, things that are locally trying to help our environments. So once we've kind of been able to preserve or sustain the habitat, then it may be a matter of trying to get those species back out into that habitat. And a big part of that involves captive breeding programs. I mentioned with California condor, when we were down to 12 or 16 of them left in the wild, the only way we could save them was to capture them, bring them into a captive breeding program, get them out of the wild so that we could breed in captivity. And then once that habitat was restored, then we could start letting them back out into the environment. So this is obviously a very complex issue, but a lot of money and time and effort and learning from our mistakes has gone into captive breeding programs. It doesn't end when that animal is released back out into the world. We have to keep monitoring those animals to make sure that they're surviving, that the habitat we created is actually suitable for them. It's not untypical that only about 10% of reintroductions are successful. In the past, it might have even been much, much less than that, because we simply didn't know that we had to do more than making a bunch of them and putting them back outside. There's a lot that we've learned from our mistakes in the past 20, 30 years. But even with that, we can create habitat, we can breed animals, and we can put them back out in that habitat. But again, only still about 1 out of every 10 are successful. It goes down to, again, how do we know that that habitat is really suitable for that animal? We don't know everything that that animal needs for survival. We can only guess, our best guess at what that animal needs, what that habitat needs to look like for that animal. And again, clearly we just don't know everything. So we continue to study, we continue to monitor, and we continue to try and improve the likelihood that when we put these animals back, they're going to be successful. I was working with an endangered species of quail that once was pretty abundant in the southwestern U.S., but as I was studying them, they were trying to reintroduce them to the refuge in southern Arizona. And so I was going back and forth from Mexico to southern Arizona, studying the native species that was left in Mexico on a ranch that was remote, and trying to relate that then to how we could manage the refuge for those quail. And as I understand now, at the time there were only a couple hundred left in the wild, and probably only a few hundred that were reintroduced to the refuge in southern Arizona. What I've heard recently is that they believe that that quail is now extinct. As much as myself and all the other scientists tried to learn and apply it, it probably still wasn't enough for that species of quail. It was actually called the masked bobwhite quail. From the standpoint of plants and animals, one of the goals of conservation biology is to create seed banks or gene banks, where we basically have collected and are storing millions of seeds in places that are basically secure and safe from things like climate change, habitat destruction. And these actually have already been used to reintroduce extinct species of plants in the wild. The challenge is that We don't have the technology quite yet for animals. We do have tissue samples and genetic samples, with the idea that maybe in the future, if something goes extinct, we'll have the technology to bring it back from extinction. But even with plants, not all seeds can be stored indefinitely. So sometimes those seeds have to be germinated, grown, and then new seeds collected and stored. So periodically that has to happen, otherwise those seeds might lose their viability. The other implication is that if these things are taken out of the environment and therefore are not exposed to changing environmental factors over time, in other words, they're not evolving with the environment, if in 100 years or 1,000 years we try to put something back in the environment that we've had stored for 1,000 years, is it even, or should it even be put back now? Because that genetic material or that seed wouldn't have been exposed to all of the changes that would have occurred while it was not in the environment. So again, lots of things that aren't just clear-cut answers that we would have to address in the future. I already talked about the Endangered Species Act, which basically authorized the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, required them actually to protect endangered and threatened species in the U.S. and worldwide. About 1,400 things are listed right now, plants and animals. Again, basically this gives them legal protection that requires the Fish and Wildlife Service to identify habitat that is either suitable or could be managed in a way that makes it good again for that species. And it requires that a detailed plan be written on exactly what the current status is, why that species became endangered, and exactly what needs to happen to recover that species. A recovery plan was written for the masked bobwhite, and I've got a copy of it on my shelf in my office. These things take years to write, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars to write because of the time and research and effort. The Endangered Species Act has been updated over time to address new issues that have popped up. And a lot of people believe it's not strong enough. It should be strengthened so that entire ecosystems are managed, not just species. I guess I sort of feel like that's what's happening now. I just look at the recovery plan for the masked bobwhite. That plan was for the quail, but it was about the ecosystem that quail lived in and how the environment had to be managed to be suitable. So I think sometimes some of those environmental groups are using laws or species to meet some bigger agenda rather than maybe truly saving a species. The spotted owl is an example that a lot of people use that fell in the lap of some environmental groups. They used the spotted owl and the habitat that the spotted owl was found in, which tended to be old growth forests or forests that were currently being logged. And so a lot of people feel that the environmental groups used the idea of the Endangered Species Act and trying to get the spotted owl listed as an endangered species, not so much to protect the spotted owl, but to stop logging. Because if the spotted owl was protected, therefore its habitat needed to be protected. Therefore that means that we wouldn't be able to cut down trees in that habitat any longer. So again, just sometimes, wherever you choose to support or provide money to, just read what they do and why they do it, and make sure you agree with it. I think most every resource manager believes that laws are necessary, and I absolutely agree with that. If we didn't have laws, we probably still would, to some degree, overexploit habitats. But sometimes these laws have gotten to where they're so hard to work with, things take so long to happen, either for the good or not, but that these things have gotten so convoluted that they almost become worthless. They don't really fit the purpose of what they were originally tended to do. So instead of making more and more and more laws every year, let's look at, kind of backing off and finding a more efficient system that's easier to work with, that protects the environment, but it also allows us to still utilize the environment. And again, that's true of the United States, but it has to be true of the world. International policies and laws are going to continue to be an important part of conservation biology. The World Conservation Strategy in 1980 was some of the earliest sort of world policy that was designed to preserve biodiversity and those essential ecosystem services. The Earth Summit in 92 that basically provided that every country that signed on to that needs to inventory its biodiversity and develop a conservation strategy. Now again, that didn't require every country in the world to do this, but those that did needed to then take inventory and come up with a plan. CITES, Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, was a huge bit of legislation that dealt with finally banning hunting, capturing, and selling endangered species or the products that we depended on from those species, which ultimately protects about 30,000 species worldwide. The challenge, again, is really enforcement. There are many countries that say, yes, we support this, but when it comes down to it, they may kind of look the other way if it provides, economic value to the country. When I was in and out of Mexico, I heard a lot of the rancher that owned the ranch that I was studying on, talking about how even though, and I mean this is kind of related, but marijuana down there, the government still said, don't grow marijuana, it's illegal. And so growing any crop like that obviously can have a big impact on the environment. So that's where I'm going with this. But the rancher told me that every once in a while the Mexican government would go bust the marijuana that was being grown on a ranch just to make a point. They'd publicize it and tell the United States, see, we're cracking down on marijuana. But the other 1,000 ranches that are growing pot the government knew about, they would just kind of let them do their thing because of the economic value it provided, not only to that rancher, but to that community. So again, by ignoring, that kind of cultivation, they basically are ignoring the environmental implications. So there are countries where, a poacher will be shot on sight and left to be eaten by the vultures. That's a pretty good deterrent, but yet that doesn't stop poaching, because the skin of a leopard or the tusks of an elephant, that is a huge amount of money to somebody living in those countries. That could feed their family for a year. So even death is not enough of a deterrent in some cases. So illegal trade continues, and it probably always will. And really one of those questions is, again, who owns the wildlife? It's nobody's property. It's everybody's property. Should I have the right to shoot a deer if it's in my backyard to feed my family? Whether or not I have a license, whether or not it's the season. Does someone living in Africa, should they have the right to shoot an elephant and sell the ivory if it feeds their family? Those are the tough kinds of questions that come up with this topic. And so then the chapter ends with a case study talking about protecting rare species. Tigers worldwide are down to only about 3,000 in the wild. They are continually illegally hunted despite the CITES and other regulations. They continue to decline in number because of loss of habitat. They continue to decline in number because of competition with humans. When in doubt, the tiger will lose. And ultimately, there really is no coordinated commitment within the countries where tigers exist to save them. Again, humans are valuing the habitat that is being lost, or the tigers themselves individually. If you kill it and sell the hide, they're valuing that more than the tiger being alive out there in the wild. We in this country may value that wild tiger more, but again, is that tiger my property, living in the United States, telling somebody in India what to do with it? The California condor. By 1982, all of the remaining condors, and the book uses the number 22, were captured and bred in captivity after their habitat was destroyed. DDT resulted in population losses. They were shot because they were considered to be negative or bad. Now that we're up to 405 in the wild, half of them now again in the wild. I think I saw a number that was much higher than what the book cites, but you know, we've gone 30 plus years and gone from 22 to 200 in the wild. I can't even begin to say how many tens of millions of dollars we've spent to try and keep the condor from going extinct. Could that money have been spent to save the habitat of a lot of other species that weren't on the verge of extinction? So what I'm saying is, would it have been a better use of a lot of money to preserve habitat for a bunch of species that weren't already almost gone from the planet? The other challenge with condors, not really true of tigers from my understanding, but condors were a species that was already, it appears, on the downswing as a species. We talked about extinction being normal, right? Species come and go. It's believed, and by looking at fossil records, so following science, the condors were once far more abundant around the United States, kind of like vultures are now. And scientists were able to track the fossil records where the condors had been declining to the point where when we started settling California, the only condors that were left were in the sort of southern part of California. So before we became so populous, the condors were already apparently disappearing just naturally. They were naturally declining, competing with vultures, other scavengers perhaps. But so now we've spent 30 plus years and millions of dollars, again, I'll use my words, but fighting nature. Nature was trying to make the condor extinct, and now we're fighting what nature apparently was trying to do. Should we fight to keep condors alive in the wild, or should we just keep them in zoos? You know, keep living animals in zoos so people can see them, as opposed to trying to keep them alive in the wild. in what was left of their habitat, Southern California, Los Angeles, where they're never going to exist again. So again, these are tough questions that there aren't easy answers to, but definitely the kinds of challenges that conservation biologists face worldwide.